Today we're looking at matters of global macroeconomics. Of course, there's all the much vaunted expectation of a global recession. And indeed, some of the countries around the world are already, the major countries are already in a state of economic recession. Perhaps will it get worse before it gets better? What is the expectation for the global economy? And how does it affect us here in Africa, especially in Nigeria, as it affects our trade and, of course, our growth and development? We have always been kind of laggards in terms of economic growth and, of course, in terms of development. But there has to be new ideas around. Joining us to discuss this today, I have with me Professor Richard Werner, an alumni of Oxford University, and also an ex-banker, an ex-central banker, and of course a guru in the industry, in the economics world. Joining us today is going to be Professor Richard Werner. Richard, welcome, and can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Thank you for having me. It's good to join you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, it's been a tough one trying to get you to come on this show. So we're going to make it very brief and very business-like. In short, from the little introduction I've done, what's your perspective on global macroeconomics right now? What's going on around the world?
Well, what we're witnessing is really the aftermath of the extremely unusual macroeconomic policies adopted by the central banks of the major industrialized countries in the year 2020. What we saw in the 2020 was widely understood monetary expansion by bank credit creation for real economy transactions to an unusual and in many countries unprecedented in the post-war extent. Because while demand was going on via credit creation, supply was restricted by Soviet-style policies. The result was extremely predictable, as I warned in my comments from April, May onward. Create so much money, put it in the hands of people to spend dramatic amounts, and you're restricting supply. You are to create significant inflation.
Yeah.
So that has been the first major strand of events that has been ongoing. And of course, inflation created in this way does take a while to feed through. Around 18 months is what I was at, more or less. European countries have had 10% inflation or more. Inflation statistics understate the actual extent of inflation. So it's likely to have been even more than that. And of course, this is something that erodes purchasing power and reduces for standard of living of the majority of inflation. So it's not a thing. It's not going to happen. It's bad news in the financial markets. I mean, it was predictable. If you create so much money and it's used unproductively, you will get inflation. So it was clear where to react to this. Interest rates were going to have to rise, which means bond prices fall. And we've seen various, bouts of shocks to the bond market as a result from this. We've now reached the point where I do not think it will be, at the moment, there's enough evidence for accelerating inflation, which is good news. So we're not really at the moment a Germany 1923 style Weimar hyperinflation scenario. Significant inflation get further out of hand and leads to a scenario. That's the good news. But clear that shock, as many people misunderstood what was happening. They were comparing to the 2008 bank monetary expansions, variously called quantitative easing, and explained at the time those were not expected to lead to inflation because they were not really money creation entering the real economy.
Yeah.
They did fuel some asset price inflation, but they were to only a minimal extent going into the real economy. Not going to be an issue in 2008. So this time round, people thought, oh, it's going to be similar to 2008, but the is adopted specifically by the central banks in March 2020 were very different. And this difference hadn't been analyzed sufficiently, I think, by most people. Just yesterday, economist who was chief economist of one of the largest banks in the world, that was his job throughout his entire career. And then he retired. Then the 2008 crisis happened. He was essentially he didn't money, and where what banks have been doing, that banks create money, and how central banks were actually expanding the money supply.
Right. Very, very interesting. But I want a few questions come up. One of them is, what could the world have done? What could these economies have done in 2020 apart from the kind of interventions they had? The second one will be that, I've been to Europe for a couple of times since after the pandemic, and there's this idea about working from home. Are we going to be able to catch up with the lost productivity and lost supply of goods and services, during the pandemic? And what do you think? Do you think that the managers of the big economies around the world are doing things right in order to get out of this scenario of inflation, about 40-year high inflation rates in those parts of the world?
Well, I mean, you've two-part questions. So the first part is about what should have been done. What should have been done. Basically, no need for any of the adopt 2020. This is where Africa has been leading the world and has been showing to many African countries, not all, but many African countries, governments decided, well, we're not going to have intrusive restrictions on people's movements, and we're not going to shut down companies, businesses, shops. We're not going to intervene and tell people to forcefully do these things. And what was the result? Well, nothing. The economy continued to do well. The medical threat that was being touted in the media turned out to be of the same scale as a normal flu. And therefore, all of these policies have turned out to be, and have proven to be, well demonstrated, completely unnecessary. And that applies also to the monetary policies adopted. So that's the sensical policies that have been adopted since 2020. But as you've noticed, also announced that that's what we really want to do. We call this the Great Reset, the future, the new world. This is the things we want to do. And of course, since then, there's been a lot of talk about how good because we need these policies for other reasons, such as, we have a problem with climate change, we're told. Well, hang on, that could make everyone really suspicious. The red flag go up at this moment. When you have the conclusion, the policy recommendations and policies already decided will take place, but reasons for clearly that doesn't make sense. That tells you that actually they're doing this for very different, and they're just coming up with different excuses to justify their predetermined course of action, and that proved none of that had been done. And citizens across the world should refuse to accept these policies and restrictions that are being imposed. You may have, now we had in the UK, local authorities, county councils announcing that actually, because we have allegedly a climate change crisis, we're going to, in a year's time and a bit, we're going to restrict literally the movement of people within, places like Oxfordshire or Canterbury, and people have to stay in a very small area, and there will be fines if they leave that, save the planet. We're being, but the script of this had been written earlier, and this is the other big red flag when you have very well scripted and well coordinated things that are being announced under some pretext. But clearly there's been no democratic debate, and there is no democratic mandate for any of this. And so I think Africa has shown the way in many countries where much of that was ignored, and Africa did really well. Also, injections of new substances that are being still trialed, gene modification therapy and all sorts. They're not implemented and given to people in Africa, and I think it's been good for the health of Africans that they've refused to follow that agenda. So there's no evidence that any of that has been necessary. Now, the other part of your question was concerns about how can we want to achieve, and that is, I think what's good for everyone is to have sustainable but high environmentally friendly economic growth and wealth expansion, equitable, and lifts people out of poverty, generates economic growth and jobs for everyone, and everyone can do well. And of course, the sort of holy grail really is to achieve this high, sustainable, equitable economic growth without inflation. And the good news is this can be done. One can achieve this in almost any country if you have the right set of policies, and at any time now. With the past is already, these are bad policies that have taken place. They don't restrict us. We can immediately switch to new policies which will deliver this high growth. And these policies do center on the monetary system. You have a decentralized banking system that ensures that money creation is used for new money, loans to small and medium-sized fashion. Many banks with many branches, many tens of thousands of loan officers kicking tires and checking loan applications of small firms, but being very pragmatic and actually giving loans where there are productive, business proposals. That is likely to deliver the non-inflationary growth that we want, because when you get new money in this way, it's linked to new business investment, to implement new technologies, to upgrade productivity, to have high goods and services. These companies will then employ more people, and we know the small firm sector is the biggest employer across the globe. It's true in every country. And this will then deliver growth, not inflation. That's really what we need to do. And the good news is we can do it now, anywhere. We can start immediately. We need, of course, people to understand. We need the policymakers to understand. And perhaps that's, where continue your good work, and perhaps we can implement that.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask you what has happened to economics as a field of study when we're now having to walk back from conclusions rather than to build evidences empirically to achieve, to get to a certain conclusion that we want to get to. We seem to be walking back from predetermined conclusions into to take decisions today in the macroeconomics world. I want you to think about that, and also I want you to think about, what do you think we should be doing out here in Africa, given the fact that our economies are still a bit, back in the doldrums and what have you, primary product economics and so on. Yeah, that's what we have here. So, but that's going to be after we come back from a very short break.
Now, as part of efforts to support Africa's goal of strengthening...
Now, looking at the activity chart, as you can see right here, a total volume of 130...
Created a Boko Haram crisis that at that time was restricted to Yobe.
How secure are they? You can see security men with blood.
This is
was the road leading up to the
Or really,
Crocodile Bridge.
if you look at England's squad, you are looking at EPL, you are looking at their names. You are not looking at...
Welcome back to the show, and we've been discussing key factors and key topics in global macroeconomics with Professor Richard Werner. Welcome back, Richard. And before we left you, I gave you a few poses to think about in terms of which way forward for us in Africa here. And also, I still wanted to recall that that's something I mentioned. My recent visits to London especially, I realized that there were very low manning levels in shops. They were very short of staff and what have you. But also I noticed that most people are working from home. And I'm wondering if that's a sustainable way of regrowing the economy to the levels of productivity that's required. So what do you think about this?
Yes, and it is a hot topic in the UK, the question of productivity. In fact, if you go back the past several years, it's become ever more urgent, the question, because it's been realized already a while ago that UK productivity has been lagging behind the productivity of other countries, competitors, even very close neighbors like Germany. And the UK situation is different and raises this fundamental question: what actually determines the productivity, and how can you boost productivity? And I think it is instructive to compare the UK economy with the German economy. You will see much a glaring difference can be changed in the UK to increase productivity. UK productivity has actually had a basically for the whole 20th century. And German productivity, of course, despite, various shocks like wars and disasters happening over this century, productivity has been extremely high and internationally very high. One measure of productivity competitiveness is current account surplus. If a country has a persistent current account surplus, that is live evidence that it is competitive and that not happen very productive. 2009, Germany, the country, was close to 80 million population in Europe, not the biggest country in the world by any means, fairly small if you compare population-wise to countries in the world. Yet, the whole world, bigger than anyone else, bigger than American exports, bigger than Chinese exports, Japanese exports. These are countries that have a multiple of Germany. I mean, in China's case, almost 30 times larger. And so it's clear that Germany, has been very competitive and very productive. The UK is on the other end of the scale in Europe. If you compare competitiveness, productivity, the UK is not doing very well. So what's the difference? You could even argue that ethnically similar, before the Norman invasion 1,000 years ago, the language spoken in England was German. They spoke Old German, Saxon. You could still go to a state called Saxony. It's just because the invaders, which is a small elite, they spoke French, then actually which was created mixing the French and the dominant German. So, you can't say, oh, the people are very different. Come on. And so why on earth is there this huge difference in productivity? Now, I've analyzed the economies, and you can look at various indicators, but when you've studied success that are high growth economies in East Asia and had an amazing high period, then the same for Korea, Taiwan, they had double-digit economic growth for decades. And then China saw that the net extremely well, and from the 80s onwards, Deng Xiaoping adopted the same policies, and then China had economic growth for 4 decades, lifting more people out of poverty than anywhere and any time in history before. If you study these high growth systems, you realize that, of course, education is important, investment in education, but also at the same time, the monetary system is very important. And all these countries have many banks, and they ensure there's a decentralized banking system with many small banks, local banks, lending to small firms. You see, small firms, they sound small and unimportant, but they are 80% of employment almost in every country. And you can imagine that that, of course, is crucial then. If you look at the numbers of firms, in most countries, 99% of all companies are small firms. You get where the monetary system has its crucial role. Key example is what happened to China. So Deng Xiaoping comes to power. He travels to Japan. He studies other countries that were successful, no doubt. He then decides, okay, we have to change something here in China. They used to have the Soviet system, and only one bank, the central bank, Gosbank, very central allocation. You know, the money, of course, clearly is what's driving the system. No transactions, no purchases take place without money. So obviously, and Deng Xiaoping realized this is not really very successful with, and hundreds and hundreds of banks in Japan, in Korea, in Taiwan, in Germany, thousands of banks. And he concluded that's what we're going to do. And so he established many banks, small banks, credit unions, savings banks, provincial banks, regional banks, of course, also a small number of national. The vast majority were small banks that he established. In total, literally thousands of banks. Officially, it's close to 5,000. Stage was even more than that, but there are some amalgamations of, you measure this, but anyway, it's very clear it was a dramatic policy change. And these small banks, incentive to lend to small companies, and small companies are the ones that will create your employment. And also when banks create money for small firms, the money is used for productive business investment, and that's the precondition for high economic. Then Chinese economic growth took off. We had double-digit economic growth for 40 years. So back to the UK and Germany and this comparison, what we find here is that before the First World War, the UK had actually a fairly strong economy, higher growth, and high productivity. But then there was a drive to amalgamate the banking system. What used to be hundreds and hundreds of banks, within 1 or 2 came 5 big banking. Actually, it's been in place for the entire 20th century. There was a report by government about what's wrong with the UK banking system. And in this report, they wrote, well, the problem is the concentration, 5 big banks dominating banking. They want to do big deals for big companies, which often ends up being financial transactions, which are not very productive and is actually a way of creating money and creating asset inflation and banking crises, but is not helping the economy. Now, this report is the Colwyn report, issued by a parliamentary commission in the year 1918. Already then they concluded the problem is the big five dominate banking. They don't lend to small firms. They don't give out long-term loans. And that's the problem. Well, it has remained the problem for so long. In the last 10 years, I've done a lot of events and educational activities in order to educate people that what create small local banks. So started movement has set up a community interest company called Local First, local-first.org.uk, which sets community banks in the UK. We hope to have the pilot bank ready actually next year, Hampshire Community Bank. That's what the UK needs, and this is why productivity has been so low. The small firms, which are the majority of employment in the UK, 66% of. So what do you expect? Of course, they cannot implement the new technologies. They cannot be leaders in productivity.
Yeah.
In Germany, when a small firm, there's a new technology, something new coming out, they know it's come out in their market. They need to adopt it quickly to stay ahead of others. They go to a company, well, they will get a decision on the day. They get the money, they get the new technology, and they stay ahead of the game. So in Germany, you have more small firms, using the international definition of SME, small and medium-sized enterprises, more small firms that are global market. They have the #1 market share in the world, or #2 or #3, these top 3 positions. We call them champion, the Olympics, gold, silver, bronze. And Germany has more small firms that are champions globally in terms of market share than the world. No country comes even close to Germany, and that's because of its decentralized banking system with hundreds and hundreds of small local independent banks headquartered locally that lend to only their local area. They know, and they create money when banks lend. It's money creation that is then newly create or upgrade, productivity, create new goods. That is wealth creation, and that's the secret of high economic growth. And we can do it anywhere. We can do it in Nigeria.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to have to end this first part of our interview at this point, and then viewers, you kindly stay tuned for another discussion with Professor Richard Werner, who has been very gracious in having this wonderful discussion with us. And I think we've learned quite a bit, especially in terms of how to create economic growth, the role of banking, the role of lending in spurring the SMEs to action. I think I must quickly note before we go that the way we understand SMEs in Nigeria seems to be a bit different from how they understand SMEs in Germany, because the SMEs in Germany are actually international players. And a lot of them, their transactions will probably qualify for large-scale sector, if you like, in Nigeria. Stay tuned as we bring another edition to you.